Thank you so much for joining the conversation today. We're talking about a poem. Well, I was going to say we're talking about a poem I really love by a poet I really love, and but I could say that every week. Um, but this is a poem that really gets to me. Um, and it was it first appeared in the New Yorker, and then it was in Elizabeth Bishop's last book. And let me read it to you. It's in that. It's also in this, which I I had something to do with. Um, and let me read it to you, and then we can talk about it. It's called Poem. About the size of an old-style dollar bill, American or Canadian, mostly the same whites, gray greens, and steel grays. This little painting, a sketch for a larger one, has never earned any money in its life. Useless and free, it has spent 70 years as a minor family relic, handed along collaterally to owners who looked at it sometimes or didn't bother to. It must be Nova Scotia. Only there does one see gabled wooden houses painted that awful shade of brown. The other houses, the bits that show, are white. Elm trees, low hills, a thin church steeple, that gray-blue wisp, or is it? In the foreground, a water meadow with some tiny cows, 2 brush strokes each, but confidently cows. Two minuscule white geese in the blue water, back to back, feeding, and a slanting stick. Up closer, a wild iris, white and yellow, fresh squiggled from the tube. The air is fresh and cold. Cold early spring, clear as gray glass. A half-inch of blue sky below the steel gray storm clouds. They were the artist's specialty. A speck-like bird is flying to the left. Or is it a fly speck looking like a bird? Heavens, I recognize the place. I know it. It's behind, I can almost remember the farmer's name. His barn backed on that meadow. There it is, titanium white, one dab. The hint of steeple, filaments of brush hairs barely there, must be the Presbyterian church. Would that be Miss Gillespie's house? Those particular geese and cows are naturally before my time. A sketch done in an hour, in one breath, once taken from a trunk and handed over. Would you like this? I'll probably never have room to hang these things again. Your Uncle George, no, mine, my Uncle George, he'd be your great uncle, left them all with Mother when he went back to England. You know, he was quite famous, an R.A. I never knew him. We both knew this place, apparently, this literal small backwater, looked at it long enough to memorize it, our years apart. How strange. And it's still loved, or its memory is. It must have changed a lot. Our visions coincided. Visions is too serious a word. Our looks, two looks, art copying from life and life itself. Life and the memory of it, so compressed they've turned into each other. Which is which? Life and the memory of it, cramped, dim on a piece of Bristol board. Dim, but how live, how touching in detail. The little that we get for free, the little of our earthly trust.
Not much.
Not much. About the size of our abidance along with theirs. The munching cows, the iris crisp and shivering,
Geese.
the water still standing from spring freshets, the yet to be dismantled elms, the geese.
Beautifully read. Beautifully read.
Well, what are your first thoughts about poem?
Absolutely spectacular.
I would agree with that.
I could go into more detail, obviously.
Yeah, go. Tom,
Okay.
Tom is in case you're not familiar with work on Elizabeth Bishop, and Tom is Elizabeth Bishop's latest biographer.
Oh.
And so he knows lots of stuff. Thank you for holding it up. Yeah.
We're in the book holding.
Yeah, great.
Glamorous picture.
Love Unknown, The Life and Worlds of Elizabeth Bishop, just in case.
Okay, well, absolutely worth reading. Must reading if you're interested in Bishop. So what makes it so spectacular for you?
First, the absolute naturalness of tone. It's somebody talking off the top of their head, and yet it's also a beautifully crafted, carefully considered as an understatement poem. It really is about the core questions of art and life. It moves so gracefully and yet with kind of certainty toward its conclusion. The word, the geese, which is perfectly placed. And it begins in this very natural way about the size of an old style dollar bill.
Does everyone
American or Canadian?
Does everyone know what an old style dollar bill looked like?
Is it bigger than the current ones?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. And this is early 20th century. I don't know when anyone know when our current dollar bills?
In the 1920s, they went to the smaller size.
Yeah. So these were larger, sort of this big rather than this big, and that is so you do get an image of how large, or actually how small, this painting is. The other reference you might not recognize is that the artist was an R.A. It's Royal Academy. So he was great uncle George was I guess I would think, Tom, you can check this. Was he Canadian and then went to
Yes, he was
England?
Canadian. He was Bishop's grandmother's brother, so great uncle.
Right.
He did go to England. He became a well-known illustrator who usually worked in black and white because he was a book illustrator. He was never a member of the Royal Academy.
Oh,
So that's a kind of inaccurate family memory. In the earlier poem that she addressed to him, or addressed about one of his paintings, A Large Bad Picture, she demotes him. She promotes him to member of the Royal Academy. She demotes him to school teacher in that poem. He became, which he did, he became a well-known artist. So it's interesting to me that in each poem, she moves him in a different direction that suits the sort of tone of, boy, he's a terrible artist in Large Red Picture, or he's a fine artist. And was she misremembering? Was she carrying on family inflation of a famous family member? Very often one doesn't know exactly why Bishop bends the truth in a particular poem.
of course, she doesn't say he's an RA.
No, the aunt says she's an RA.
It's
He's
her
an
aunt
RA,
who
right? So she's
reporting this to her, and
so
she
it
doesn't.
could, right, exactly. So it could be family inflation of the reputation of the great uncle. So either way, it works. And there are other ways in which she bends the truth a little bit, which she always said that her poems were incredibly truthful, but that was not actually true sometimes. When you're a biographer, you learn these fine-grained details, and so pardon me for inflicting them on you.
Oh, thank you.
In an interview, she said that he had studied at the Royal Academy. So I wonder whether that, if that was true, whether that became the family inflation, that he went from taking classes there to being an RA.
Yeah, makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah. What about poetically, all this reference to money in the first section of the poem? The very first line compares it to a dollar bill. Of course, American or Canadian is very autobiographical, because Bishop was American, but her mother was Canadian, and her mother's family was Canadian, and she lived with her grandmother in Great Village, Nova Scotia, when she was a child. So her own ambiguity of nationality is already there in the second line of the poem. But what about all these references to money, and then the word free becomes is really, it seems to me, especially loaded in relation to all of these references to money. Catherine, what were you were agreeing with me?
Yes, yes. Hearing you read, I love this poem, and I've read it many times.
Good.
But hearing you read it, I heard the pun of free, meaning both it doesn't have value, monetary value, and also it's free. It's like
Right. Yeah.
Another thing that I heard in your reading, which was so wonderful, is the way the poem picks up energy. At first she's just, it's about this, or it might be this, or this kind of, she seems old, she seems disengaged, but then it must be Nova Scotia. And then excitedly, I recognize, and then she's in it emotionally, and so are we.
That moment at the beginning of the third stanza, where she says, "Heavens, I recognize the place." This just sort of amazing moment to I mean, we're following her. You know, she's really, you know, describing this thing that she seems to be looking at, although we're not sure she's actually looking at it or just remembering looking at it. And then, but we're so in the action of her mind as she's as she's taking in what's in this painting and why this minor family relic has real importance to her.
It feels like her impression of the painting changes during the course of the painting, that she's slowly opening up to it, that her, in the first stanza, she may not think that much of it, but then by the end of it, she's inside the painting, you know, she's with it.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the structural beauties is that it goes from one kind of narrative poem and then it kind of shifts gears at that second. It turns into a totally different narrative poem. So it goes from a memory poem to we're active. We're actively in that narrative.
One of the, I think, strange and compelling things about this poem is the way it relates to Large Bad Picture, which is the bad early picture, and it really is a bad picture, by the same uncle. And the same thing happens. She suddenly enters into this painting in a way that she's participating in it. And I won't read the whole early part, but if you don't mind, I'll read the ending. She's hearing, she's looking at the ends of the black birds, and, you know, painting a bird as an N, you know, an italic or cursive N is what we did as kids, you know, when we were painting birds. And then she says, one can hear their crying, the only sound there is, except for occasional sighing when a large aquatic animal breathes. And I should say that we're in, again, kind of like Nova Scotia, some northern place that's a harbor. And so you can hear the seabirds and the large aquatic animals. Then in the pink light, the small red sun goes rolling, round and round and round the same height in perpetual sunset, comprehensive, consoling, while the ships consider it. Apparently, they have reached their destination. It is hard to say what brought them there, commerce or contemplation. Now, these poems are written about 40 years apart, and about the same great uncle, a bad picture, a good picture. Lloyd told me that this work that became the inspiration of poem was called by her friends who saw it in the apartment on Lewis Wharf, Small Good Picture, because it was a good picture. And but the same thing happens in both poems. Of you suddenly enter the painting and it comes alive and is given immense emotional and intellectual value. And we end up with commerce and contemplation, which is the same money versus thought element that you had in Large Bad in the other one. And it's typical of a lot of Bishop poems, which start slowly and quietly and do in fact build energy and end up with this amazing epiphany that seems to come out of nowhere, but has been carefully planned all along.
And in both poems, there's a pivot as she changes senses. In poem, it's cold.
Mm-hmm.
That's a moment when the poem pivots.
Mm-hmm.
And in the other, it's crying when you hear rather than see.
Right. The silence turns into sound. Exactly.
One of the things that I like about the contrast between the business about money and value and the freedom. It seems to me that the freedom is absolutely inextricable from the sense of intimacy that she creates. I'm always struck by from the attention to one brush stroke or one squiggle. There's this incredible sense of intimacy between Bishop and the painting and the place and the whole compression. Anyway, I love it.
I mean, it's interesting what used to be her most famous poem before she wrote One Art was her poem The Fish.
Mhm.
And in that poem she describes the fish almost as if it were a painting, that the colors and the textures and it is something that she she had a great eye, and she really loved to she got into describing what she saw or what she imagined in her head. Something that occurred to me reading the poem aloud. I mean, it's a poem I know pretty well, and it never quite hit me in the first stanza, the word spent. Useless and free, it has spent 70 years as a minor family relic. And what a great choice of words that is in relation to all these other financial references in the poem. She was an artist herself. She painted a number of watercolors, and they're very charming. They're on the covers of a couple of her books. And the whole hold it up again, Gail. Higher. We can only see the words. A little higher, higher. Yeah, that's a watercolor she did of a town in Mexico. Thank you.
Can I say something?
Please.
Probably was in everything that everyone has said already, but I think the thing that is so Bishop and so beautiful to me about her and about this poem is the idea of the thing of a modest size opening a world of every memory, and that she's sort of saying it's just a little nothing, and then this blossoming of memory and everything, and she knows what she's doing as a poet doing it, but we're sort of brought along to that expansion, and it seems to me that that's so much her voice and her way of looking at things and her own paintings, that this is one of my favorite poems in the world. And I'm so glad that people are responding to it.
Yehudi.
And probably a sense that she had of herself.
Yes.
No doubt.
Modest, but completely serious about her work.
Exactly. I'm struck by the act of simultaneously describing a thing in the painting and describing the method by which it was achieved in the technique, the paint itself. I don't think I've ever seen that or felt that before. That simultaneity has to do also with the simultaneity that she's trying to dramatize with time and the far-flung relations of family. It's really fascinating, I think, what she sees, what she can bring together. But that business of describing and at the same time telling you how it was done, amazing. Especially maybe the squiggle straight out of the tube.
One of my favorite words in the whole poem. Gail, what were you going to say? Gail, did you have?
I was just thinking it's a digression of the friendship between Bishop and Lowell and the enormous differences in their approaches, and yet their souls as poet really speaking to each other. But his, she's saying, my people were nobody, and his people founded America,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, Lloyd,
Yes.
two quick things. So, adding to what Gail and Yehudi was saying, the dollar bill reference is so common. I'm perhaps associating like an emblem herself. I'm as common as a dollar bill in everybody's pocket. But of course, she's hinting at, if you stop and look at the dollar bill, it's an etching, an engraving, and it's finely detailed, and there's a whole world there. But we don't pay attention to that. It's just in our pocket, like a lot of lives, like Emily's I'm Nobody. And then I was reading someplace, and I forget where, but you or Tom will know. There was a quote from Lowell about her that said, she spent a lifetime trying to impersonate an ordinary woman.
It's actually James Merrill.
Oh, I thought it was Lowell. Okay.
No, it's James Merrill.
But isn't she-
because it was after she died.
Oh,
And which was a couple of years after Lowell died. So, it was James Merrill's reminiscence of her. Yeah.
but it seems like a lot of her poems are the guise of I'm nobody, who are you? While she can clearly become this spectacular mind working out what all us nobodies ought to see in our lives, but we spend them carelessly because we don't pay attention.
Love it.
Ellen, yeah.
I'm thinking that this feels like what I was thinking when I looked at this poem and read this hugely rich, detailed, nuanced poem that's called Poem. And that's just this whole modest, it's as if she's offering it to us in such a soft, sort of sideways way.
I want to bring up. Let's do it now. I want to bring up the whole issue of the title, because I think the title is really important, and kind of it seems like a throwaway title. So many. Certainly so many 19th century poems were just called poem because, the poet couldn't think of a title. And Bishop's titles are really, she has wonderful titles and brilliant titles, but a couple of her poems seem to be generic titles. So she has a poem called Cestina, which is the form of that poem. One of her very last poems is called Sonnet, and an early sonnet of hers, when she was still a student, she called Sonnet. And then this generic title poem. So it's something that she did occasionally, but every time she did it, it's really loaded with meaning, and it's deceptively a throwaway. And I certainly have my own theories about why she called this poem, but which I will, if you twist my arm, I will I will expound. But what do you think, Gail?
I was like, consider your arm twisted. My feeling, it's a thing about a thing. The poem is a thing, like an old style dollar bill is the thing.
And the painting.
And the painting is a thing. Yeah.
Is a thing. And Tom?
Yeah, I have a kind of basic common sense to me. thought, which is simply that we've got a painting and we've got a poem. So poem is emphasizing what it is. This is a poem. That is a painting. Let's consider how painting and poem relate to each other. And I think she said, oh, I just couldn't think of a title or something like that. But she's calling attention to the form, the medium that she's working in, as compared, contrasted, and also connected to the form that her great uncle was working in. And so there's a kind of underlining of the differences and yet also a pull toward the similarities of the two.
People,
Especially,
Catherine?
yeah, you and Tom can correct me about this, but I believe it was while she was still a student advisor in a notebook that she wrote that her aspiration as a poet was not to set down thoughts, but to show the mind thinking. And I think this poem does that, you know, breathtakingly.
Yeah, to dramatize the mind in action is the way she characterized it. And yes, that's exactly what she does. She never really deviated. That was about 1934. And she never really deviated from that formal approach. William Carlos Williams talked about the poem as a field of action. And in some ways, his style is very different from hers. But her poems are always fields of action as well, with the mind in a process.
And she even projects it forward, you know, when starting with elms are first mentioned in the second stanza as, you know, in a commonplace way and in a list. And then in the last line, that to me, heartbreaking. Hyphenated, the yet to be dismantled elms. You know, that she looking at us and that it, you know, it takes us so into her mind and her heart that looking at a scene that she tells us is early spring and still some coldness, that she sees what will happen. These elms that will come into will die.
Yes. Yeah, I want to get back to that. I think that's really crucial. Ted, would you tell some of your comments are flashing across my screen very quickly, and I'm seeing some really interesting comments. But would you make them a little more public?
Oh dear. Well, you asked about the title.
Yeah.
And it seems like the title that a child might use to title a poem. Mom, this is my poem. So it's a kind of small nothing, a kind of little tiny thing that really is insignificant and means very little. And then, and of course, by the end of the poem, we are forced into a world of meaning that is way beyond the simple word poem. So that's my thought.
Also, but what I caught in your chat comment was the word little, and that's a really important word in this poem.
Exactly.
It's a really important word in Bishop, in all her work. I thought it was maybe the most frequent word that she ever used, although I was corrected about that, and I can't remember what her most frequently used word was. But yeah, exactly, the little that we get for free. But little is a word that she used a lot. And I think in this poem, it's especially important. that the word little, uh, the kind of the small things that are captured in the painting, which she also recaptures in the poem, which in both cases have to do with the memories of both the artist, the visual artist, the painter, and the poet. Uh, um, I one thing I don't want to I don't want to I don't want to I don't want to forget this moment. Something else struck me while I was reading the poem. Um, this is the middle of the second stanza. I just don't want to forget that this sort of happened to me while I was reading it. But it's sort of just past the middle of the second stanza, up closer, a wild Irish, white and yellow, fresh squiggled from the tube. I absolutely love that phrase. But what follows is the air is fresh and cold. Cold early spring, clear as gray glass. But the air is fresh and cold. And she's not just describing the painting. She's really living it. She's living that experience of what she feels when she looks at that painting. And this is before she realizes that she actually knows the place. But that, you see why that seemed so striking to me. There's already something very deep and very personal in her experience of looking at or remembering this painting, and already kind of being part of the picture, actually physically experiencing that the temperature, which is kind of out of nowhere, except that it's part of the heart of what's happening in this poem. The time of, oh, thank you, David. The time it, yeah, that there is this process of discovery. It doesn't seem to be there at the very beginning of the poem, but we're kind of with her as she is discovering this, as you say, this recognition, her not just remembering the painting, but actually remembering the place and what it felt like to be there at the time it was, or what it must have been like to be there at the time that it was painted.
Can I say something?
Please.
In relation to what you've been saying and in relation to the title, it seems to me that throughout the poem, there's a contrast between certainty and uncertainty. First of all, I confess I was in the camp of people who thought that the title was kind of a cop-out. So I decided to argue against myself and see if I could figure out why it would not be a cop-out. And so I came up with this idea that for example, the uncertainty, you're talking about sort of easing her way into the experience. It's all over the place. One of the most obvious things in the second stanza about that gray blue wisp, or is it? And she doesn't say this is Nova Scotia. She says, well, it must be Nova Scotia. And down, she said, I can almost remember the farmer's name. Would that be Miss Gillespie's house? So they're not blanket statements about this is this, this is this, this is this. So,
Right.
and then when she gets to the last stanza, where I guess I would say she's trying to ascribe meaning to this fabulous experience that she has allowed us to share. I mean, the quality of the description is mind-bogglingly good. It's just, that's
Right.
why this poem works so well. I mean, it's just beyond the pale. It's so good. and so I think this certainty versus uncertainty is not resolved. And therefore, to call it poem is a way to hold these two things in balance and not resolve in one direction or the other, which could happen if she had a different title, and then it would be a different poem. The end.
No, but that's yeah. I think that's right, and it's also it's partly and in a large extent it is a poem about looking at art.
Yes.
And what we experience in a museum, or looking at an art book and kind of trying to figure out, well, is that squiggle intended? Is it a fly speck? Or is it a bird that's like a fly speck, or is it a fly speck looking like or is it just a fly speck? And this she is kind of living through our experience of dealing with a work of art, which could also doesn't have to be a painting. It could also be a poem. And the way we read poems, we're also trying to figure out what things mean and how they go together. Yehudi, I think you were about to say something.
I was about to admire, but also to say that the punch in the groin for me is the words, not much.
Yeah. Let's look at that last.
Finish by, even when she's in the last stanza, when she's not talking about specifically about the painting, but talking about memory and life, she says, which is which? So
yeah, I mean, that reminds me a little, she loved Keats, and it reminds me of the end of the Ode to a Nightingale, where Keats says, was it a vision or a waking dream?
Yeah.
And
yeah,
that there's a difference between those two, and Keats hasn't resolved the answer to that.
Yeah.
And what do we have as human beings? What do we have? What do we possess? What is of value to us? And let's look at that. Let's look at that last stanza, because it's really it does take us to another level. I never knew him. We both knew this place, apparently, this literal small backwater. Literal is such a surprising and interesting and kind of loaded word, because it's partly a little bit critical of the painting, that it is sort of trying to be a photograph of the place itself. And then, if it is in fact, which it is in fact, Nova Scotia, where she spent so much of her childhood, the kind of literalness of the community, the even maybe unimaginative aspect of small town life. This literal small backwater. Looked at it. We both knew this place. Looked at it long enough to memorize it. Our years apart. So now memory is really. I mean, memory has been part of the poem before. Is that one of my favorite things in the poem is about Nova Scotia having having those houses painted that awful shade of brown, and it's funny that she's being so frank about her yeah um, looked at it long enough to memorize it. Our years apart. How strange. So there there are these two. There's this writer, decades after this artist, both reproducing from memory their image of this literal small backwater. How strange, and it's still loved. So this is a whole new dimension in the poem, love, that that there's some very there's some very deep feeling that this experience of looking at, remembering the painting and remembering the place kind of elicits in her. And it's still loved, or its memory is. It must have changed a lot. So that's what happens with memory. Our memories are their memories because they don't exist. The things themselves don't really exist anymore. Time has changed everything. It must have changed a lot. Our visions coincided, and then seems to me pure Elizabeth Bishop, and the sort of humility and modesty that she herself brings into the poem. Gail, I see you nodding and smiling. What are you thinking?
Visions.
It imbues everything.
Yeah. Visions in quotes.
Right.
Visions is too serious a word. Well, she doesn't, this is just a poem. She doesn't want to be too, highfalutin.
Bishop, but yeah, but it goes through all her work.
And in fact, it just occurs to me, what I said before about Keats, that she herself, the last line of the Ode to a Nightingale is, was it a vision or a waking dream? And she's already she uses the word vision. I think she has somewhere bumping around in her memory, in her head, is the Ode to a Nightingale, which is in many ways a poem about art and what art can and can't do. Our looks, two looks, art copying from life, and then she sort of knows that's a cliche and puts it
from vision to saying no. Our looks,
our two looks,
too fancy and pretentious.
Right, exactly. Art copying from life and life itself. So there's a dichotomy that arouses contemplation. What's the difference? Art copying from life and life itself, life and the memory of it, so compressed they've turned into each other. And I mean, isn't that what we want art to do? I mean, we want art to be part of our living experience. Art copying from life and life itself, life and the memory of it, so compressed they've turned into each other. Which is which? Was it a vision or a waking dream? Which is which? Life and the memory of it. And then she sort of takes it, or seems to be taking it down a notch. Cramped, dim, on a piece of Bristol board. Dim. And then this just, you know, this just gets to me every time I read it. Dim, but how live, how touching in detail, the little that we get for free.
Not much.
The little of our earthly trust.
Not much.
I mean, not much. And this is, you know, it's verging on a kind of tragic view of
Oh yeah.
of what, you know, of what life is.
What we can do, what's available.
What we can do. Yeah, Catherine.
I just want to, that word that we're coming to, abidance, though, I think that brings in the hymn, doesn't it?
Abide with us.
Oh, abide with me. Yeah.
I'm asking a question. I've never seen the word abidance except in this poem and except in that hymn.
I think
So how other people know the word?
I think it means, or is sometimes used to mean, the small amount of money you have to live on.
Oh,
So a retiree or someone on a pension would have an abidance on which they could abide, on which they could live. So it's a kind of monetary term.
oh,
And yet it is also, you know, what do we have in the world? We have our abidance, which is about the small size of a American or Canadian dollar bill, but it's also a lot. If it's what we have, it's very important. And so if it's the size of our abidance, we better appreciate it. You know, I think all of that is weighted into that one word.
Well,
And I think Lloyd's point that there's this big financial element in the poem kind of comes really home there.
I did not know that.
wow,
Gail, what were you going to say?
what we live on. Our
What we live on. Yeah. But also, I mean, I've always, I mean, that's such a loaded word, because our abidance also means, well, you're living.
Lifespan.
Their lifespan. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So well, that really adds to that extraordinary moment already. And then about the so, and it's not just me, the poet, or my great uncle, the artist, but it's also the munching cows, the iris, crisp and shivering. And how, I mean, these descriptions are just so alive. These figures in the painting and in her poem are just are so alive. Even so many from so many decades ago, from so long ago, they're still alive in the painting and in this poem, because they're in the painting. They're not. I mean, they may look like they have the cows are chewing on something, but it's more active than that in the poem. They're alive and feeding and munching in the poem. The iris crisp and shivering. Well, it's, she's already been feeling that chill in the air earlier in the poem, and now it's even the plants the flowers are feeling this. The water still standing from spring fresh, still, and then we get to this whole the point that you've mentioned before, that this kind of time, the water still standing. Well, still, I mean, this is from a century ago, or almost a century ago, but there it is in the painting and in the poem and in our memory of it. And then this amazing, heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking, I completely agree with you, the yet to be dismantled elms. And there is a whole history, a whole cycle of nature and human interaction with nature and a kind of doom. What lasts? All right, so now we have a question about the geese and an offer to talk about why that's such a great way to end this poem.
Okay, well, let me go back to the yet to be dismantled elms, and maybe everybody's already thought about this, but Dutch elm disease had basically wiped out the elms in the U.S. by that.
North America, yeah.
And well, it was creeping up from the south to the north, and there were still living elms in Nova Scotia at the time Bishop wrote the poem. And if you know James Merrill's overdue pilgrimage to Nova Scotia, that's the right word, he talks about in the poem that, hey, there are still elms here. Now, when I visited Nova Scotia for the first time in 1995, there were seriously diseased elms, that were in Great Village, and all the foliage had fallen off. They were still barely alive. And of course, if you take down a tree in a place where there are buildings, a tree surgeon goes in and dismantles the tree. So either some elms have already been dismantled, or she knows that they're dying and they will have to be dismantled. So there's a lot of very specific history and anticipation and pressure on those words yet to be dismantled. These elms are doomed, even if they're still there. And so they live in the poem. They live in her memory. Maybe you can even see them, but they're not going to survive very long. And the fact that they were still alive in the 1990s suggests the slow, or somewhere suggests the slow process of change in time. So that's the elms. Now let's talk about the geese. Okay. Yeah. I mean, for one thing, it's just 2 words. So she's, the geese have to bear the whole weight of the poem, following the previous phrase in the same line, the yet to be dismantled elms. They are living. They're going to be around for a really long time. They're frequently mentioned in the poem. And in a way, you could see this 2-word phrase, the geese, article and noun, as the opposition to, the time, the destroyer, and yet life and nature continuing. The irises are still there. They're going to come back. One thing that just struck me is, which is a kind of paradox, the water's still standing from spring freshets, following the reference to irises. Well, yes, there is the phrase standing water, but it's the irises that we would normally think of as standing. So she's kind of done a flip that I didn't, I've been reading this poem for 35 years.
We're running an errand.
Okay. And my wife is going up. I think that has an effect on us that I haven't noticed in the actually 50 years I've been reading this poem. So she's really very subtly working the language very hard at the end.
Oh. And she's already, in her previous reference to the geese, she's already said that the geese in the painting, of course, are no longer, they're gone.
Yeah.
They're long gone.
Those actual geese, but now there are new geese, so right. It's the cycle of change and return. She does the same thing in at the end of North Haven, where you have the birds repeating and repeating, but they're not the same birds.
Not the same birds. Yeah. Yeah. Catherine. Catherine, then Bill.
3 little things. I just looked up the text of Abide With Me, and I don't see abidance in it.
There's no abidance.
But not abide. It's just abide in. It's like that. And what I was looking at syllables of words, and there's no question that yet to be dismantled is the longest word in the poem. And it just boom, get this, all this nice stuff about elm trees, low hills, a thin church, all of that stuff. There's the yet to be dismantled, and geese come back every year. I mean, that's the thing. That the earlier geese, sure, they're not there anymore, but geese always come back. They're a cyclical creature. And that seems to me more the last word than the dismantling of the elms.
But that...
The geese abide.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But that wonderful... But I'm so glad you mentioned this, because rhythmically, this complicated compound word, the yet to be dismantled elms, and then this just very quick final simple little phrase that comes after it. It's just I mean, we talk about the amazing visual quality in Bishop, and this poem is such a great example of that, just as a description of a painting and of her memory, but also the sound and the rhythmic sense in the poem. Da 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 da. But
it strikes me again that the last line is perfect iambic pentameter. I just noticed
to
that.
Be dismantled elms, the geese.
Yeah. And yet it's also very complex with that long word yet to be dismantled, with the hyphens and the comma. caesura, partial caesura, right before the bum, perfect iambic foot. Yeah, it's amazing how she has put all of that together in that final line. And I just counted the previous line has 7 syllables. So it's, we're not in iambic pentameter until the end.
Well, she's
no.
it seems to me she's doing. I mean, I was mentioning Keats before, but it seems to me that the real poetry ancestor of this poem is Wordsworth, and that in terms of something like a poem like Tintern Abbey, a kind of meditation on life and memory, and that it's a poem that is largely in some version of iambic pentameter. That is, they're mostly 5-beat lines, very traditional, but that certainly Wordsworth and Keats and Elizabeth Bishop also feel free that not every line has to have 5 stresses. That there can be shorter lines as well, or even sometimes longer lines, but usually shorter lines. So there's a kind of shapeliness that isn't just mechanical. And even Bishop's 5-beat lines, although, Tom, I'm so glad you mentioned that last line, that the finality of a da-da, 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 da-da at the end of the poem really has real power to it. But that earlier in the poem, even the opening line, which is sort of a 5-beat line, but it's not a rigid iambic pentameter line. It's much more conversational about the size of an old style dollar bill. Well, it's 5 beats, yeah. but it's not a kind of rigid, poetic meter. It's much more flexible than that. So how many people want to see the painting?
Oh, yeah.
I cheated. I already looked.
Well, let me show you something, because Jennifer Clarvo, who couldn't be here today, told me about this book, which I have acquired, called Can Poetry Save the Earth by John Felsteiner. And it has a reproduction of, so this is the book. That's how big the book is. And it has an actual size reproduction of the painting. Tom, you mentioned that the painting has been cleaned, and the image that you sent, which I will show I'll try to show everyone, is much brighter than this image, but this is what it looked like for many years.
It's bigger than she claimed it was.
It's a little bigger than she claimed it was. Yeah, it is bigger than. But there are also details in the painting and details in the poem, details in the painting that are not in the poem, and details in the poem that are really not quite in the painting. So let me try to share the screen. And no, I don't.
You don't have the bottom. Let
me see what happens.
Here you go.
All right, I don't hear it.
Oh no! Here it is. There it is.
Oh wow!
Oh, beautiful.
So this is after it's been cleaned, but this is not the way she remembered it. She remembered it as that other image that I showed you, that much grayer, darker image.
Dim.
But it's clearly not a sketch. It's a very finished, if small, painting. And I think that there's a bit of deception going on there because the poem has a conversational tone to it. But, you know, the poem wasn't just thrown off any more than this painting was. There was a lot of craftsmanship in both of them.
Can you see? I just tried to make it larger. Can you
Yes.
see?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, good.
Lloyd, I have a question.
Yes.
After the cleaning, did they ever figure out whether the bird was there or whether it was a fly?
I don't know. I don't know when the painting was cleaned. Tom, do you know when it was?
Let's see. I think it was with maybe about 10 years ago. I could look it up. But I remember being, I think one of my friends, I think it might have been David Hoke, sent me this. And I said, wait, no, that's way too bright. And Lloyd and I Lloyd, you saw it in Bishop's apartment, right?
Yeah.
And Lloyd and I looked at it together in Key West when they had a show of Bishop's art. And I looked at it for a long time. I was too stupid to take a photo of it. But I remember it as much more like Bishop described it, with those gray greens and steel grays, which I think you would have trouble finding in this version. And so I think although there may be some deception, it was not, it looked more like the poem than it does now. Also, I really looked very hard for that thin church steeple, that thin gray wisp, or is it, that she says is barely there. It was not there. That's something that she puts into the painting, and we could ask why she does that. She says, kind of covers herself and says, it's barely there. But no, I spent 20 minutes trying to find that, and I did not. And I think, Lloyd, you may even remember us searching for it.
Yeah, I do.
Anyway, I'll throw this out. Anyone have any thoughts on why she would
Lloyd, for us to see the book, you need to hold it up and also speak so that in speaker view, it gets large enough that we can actually see
the version
Correct.
in the book. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
If you just murmur something.
Okay, so if I say something, does this help?
Yes.
Lift it
Keep
up just a
talking.
little more.
Keep talking. Okay.
And lift it up just a little bit.
Higher.
There you go.
Yeah.
Now
keep
talk.
talking.
Now talk. Okay.
You can just recite the poem from memory.
I can read you the blurbs on the back of this book.
Yeah, do that.
They are by Gary Snyder, Harold Bloom, and Evan Boland. So it's an admired book, but I didn't know about it until Jennifer Clarvo mentioned it to me, and then
Who's the author again, Lloyd? Can you say the author again?
Yes, John Felsteiner, or Felstiner. Can Poetry Save the Earth? A Field Guide to Nature Poems. It's not a title that would have lured me to acquire it. But the other thing it has in it, and the other selling point that Jennifer mentioned to me, was that it actually has a photograph of the lapis lazuli carving that Yeats's great poem Lapis Lazuli is about, the Chinese carving of the men on the hill looking down at the rest of the world. So
Lloyd?
yes.
Can I ask
Bill?
that we go back to a line that feels odd in the poem to me, but also brings up an embarrassing association. Heavens, I recognize the place, I know it, with an exclamation point. And this may hinge on money and soul in the poem, but the association is the ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it. Know it, said Scrooge. I was apprenticed here. There's that. strange kind of, I recognize the place, I know it, whether that was an earworm of hers or intentional or it's an earworm of mine, I don't know, but it's striking in a way. Heavens, I recognize this place, I know it. And he'll go on to say Fezziwig, alive again, of course.
Yeah. I'm sure she read Christmas Carol when she was a child, and but Heavens
It's not in.
No, but that was something that she said.
Mhm.
That was it was one of her locutions, sort of expression of recognition, and to me it just feels like her voice in the poem, kind of interjecting as not her. I mean, she writes in the way that she speaks. I mean, her poems are so spoken, and including this poem, and then there's suddenly an interjection that doesn't seem like writing. That she's writing a kind of spoken English, and the good English that she speaks, and then something different happens that doesn't seem even like writing. Heavens, I recognize this place. I know it, and that sounds to me like the person I knew, and how she would talk, especially if she got excited about something, or even dismayed about something.
But since everyone is talking about how utterly intentional she is here, it seems like it can't really be an accident that the word heaven and the church appear in that one stanza, and that the church is an almost non-existent thing, since she's going to talk about our being and our soon-to-be doom that's going to envelop everybody but the geese. The one thing that maybe counters it, she'd like to believe there's a church there, but barely, if there at all. And I thought there was a hint of intentionality there.
I wanted to say something about the steeple.
Yes.
If I throw something in, I just always imagined that there really was a steeple in this painting, but I think it's utterly fascinating that there wasn't. And it makes me think of the church steeple in the opening. Actually, I think it runs through the incredible story In the Village, which I think is in Questions of Travel, right? Was it the centerpiece of... and if you haven't read it, you have to go and read the first paragraph of that story, where the church steeple is a kind of, God, I don't even know how to describe it, but the last bit of that first paragraph, it's a paragraph about a scream, the echo of the scream hangs over that Nova Scotian village. And the paragraph ends, its pitch would be the pitch of my village. Flick the lightning rod on the top of the church steeple with your fingernail, and you will hear it. So that steeple has an incredible kind of intensity and connection to the mother's scream and life and the memory of it in Nova Scotia. Anyway,
but
the steeple.
Right, but the major building in Great Village, Nova Scotia, is the Presbyterian Church with its steeple.
Yeah.
So what she is remembering is something from her own her own personal experience of that place that is oddly missing from the painting.
Right.
And it's so embedded in her memory, life and the memory of it, that she imagines that it's in the painting.
Yes.
and then kind of waffles about, well, maybe it's really not there.
It doesn't have the same power. It's not a haunting steeple, a terrifying steeple. Yeah, wonderful. I'm so happy that the steeple came up. I had no idea it wasn't there. Wonderful.
I think you made a beautiful point there, because it is such an important image in her work, and particularly in the village. And just factually, her house, her grandparents' house, was directly across the street from the Presbyterian church. You step out the door and that's what you see. And it's looming. It's a very tall steeple. It's looming up above you. And it's specifically a Presbyterian church that she mentions in the poem. So in a way, her house is invisible, but if you know Bishop really well, present in the background of the poem, and therefore all the history of it is there, barely there, we could say, but sketched into the poem. Yeah. So I think
that steeple is
exactly right.
Is probably 3 times higher than any other building in the town.
If not 5 to 10.
If not 5 to 10. Yehudi?
Is it possible that the disappearance or the non-appearance of the steeple is related to the dismantling of the elms in her thought? A stretch.
Obviously the painting is not a painting of the town. It's a painting of the fields outside of the town. And so
in a painting of memory of the town.
And
no.
Yeah, well, the painting itself is a kind of little landscape with barely any reference to the town at all. And the town is just, it's I think Great Village is such a paradoxical name for this little tiny, town that has like 3 streets in it, and a church in the center of the town. Catherine.
Since we are talking about the church, I'd like to come back to Abidance and the hymn, which I know I love the hymn. I know it. I sing it. The word abidance isn't in it, but it seems to me she was so steeped in hymns, the songs of her childhood, that I've always imagined that it would have that association to her, and that the hymn has the same pulling between, a wish for consolation and a sense that really friendship fades and earthly pleasures flee.
There were, I believe, not Abide With Me, but there were 3 hymns sung at her memorial, because Alice Methvessel, her partner, knew how much she loved hymns, and how much she actually loved the performers who were asked to the performer who was asked to sing and accompany the singer, and they were people, Boston musicians whom Elizabeth Bishop especially admired. Jane Struess and Ben Zander were the people who played the hymns at her memorial.
Were the hymns?
But I don't think "Abide With Me" was one of those hymns.
Do you remember any of them?
I'd have to look it up. Hymns are Protestant hymns are not a part of my growing up experience. Somewhere I have a program from from that event, and it will say what the hymns are. I'll try to find it, and I'll let you know.
No worries.
Ask Jane Struess.
Yeah, ask Jane Struess. I could do that.
It's quicker.
You're telling me. It's somewhere in this stuff behind me. Any other comments or thoughts? We're really just about out of. Gail, please.
I just wanted to, in general, say that I have read that everybody's childhood place is Edenic, even, street urchins in slums, that they play on the street together and that's their Eden. But Bishop was wrested away from her Eden. And I find that as a sort of knowing that to make this poem even richer, and poems like that about not North Haven,
Great Village.
And so the sort of piercing, loving description and in the end, the sort of dismantling of all of it for her, which she did return to, but she could never live there again. She lost everyone really in her childhood at that point, and she lost her place. So she and her Scabrous dog were in Worcester of all places, and then but never to return. And that it doesn't make this sadder to me. It makes me feel even more the intensity of her descriptive memory of all of it. The things that we live in and grow past, sometimes we don't remember our 6-year-old world as well as she does.
Yeah, it was heartbreaking for her to be removed by her father's wealthy parents and moved to Worcester, where she was absolutely miserable, really until she went to college. And your heart can break for this child. And there are these wonderful stories in The Village, and a story called Gwendolyn about her childhood experiences in Nova Scotia. Also, what's that very late story that starts in Brazil, but that she remembers her family in Great Village.
Memories of Uncle Nettie.
Memories of Uncle Nettie, yeah. But that if she hadn't been removed from this Edenic childhood, would we have these poems?
That's I was thinking that this is so important to her, and the memory is so piercing and sharp, and memories with such love for that place, and longing, and it's all dismantled for her.
Catherine?
The one stanza essentially you omitted in this discussion is the one with the conversation. Do you think that builds up to the end or makes the transition between the picture and the thought? I mean, it's quite striking to have that. Would you like this? I'll probably never have room to hang these things again.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and that,
did she do that often in other poems? It's just such a striking, odd thing.
Well, she does. She does quote conversations in other poems, and it is the thing that sets up the whole question of, what is of value, what is, what is our the little of our earthly trust, and I think you're right, and it does set up that whole thing about well, the family, we don't really care about this painting. It doesn't mean anything to us. You want it? You can have it. And of course it means everything to her. Or, even if she's not actually looking at it while she's writing the poem. Any other comments?
Means
Marie, I'm sorry?
means the world to her.
Yeah, the world to her. Yeah, means the world to her.
I have just one little comment, which is that Bishop was a watercolorist or painter herself, a pretty good one. Her book, her work was published after her death, but none of her paintings ever earned $1 in her lifetime.
In her lifetime. Yeah.
So she was sort of like that. I remember a story, she lived in Key West, and I went to an art exhibit of Tennessee Williams's work. And the story was that Tennessee Williams would be painting on his porch, and people would walk by and look at the painting and buy it before he had finished it. And then they'd come back to collect it when it was finished. Whereas Bishop was also painting in Key West, but she was not Tennessee Williams. People didn't really know her, and they were not buying her work at all. So it's sort of she was living in a environment where, her art, although she did get paid by the New Yorker, was comparatively non-commercial. And that's a kind of point of identification with her great uncle, particularly at painting and her second art, which was as a painter.
Would say from time to time that she would have rather been a painter than a poet. But she never tried to sell her paintings, and she didn't imagine that they were of much value to anyone. Although, boy, they were selling for quite a lot of money after she died.
Can I throw out one quick one? It just occurred to me now when we were talking about the conversation with the aunt that's quoted. I never really thought about the word, the idea of knowledge in this poem. And I was just noticing, he was quite famous. I never knew him. We both knew this place. 3 times it's used in just 2 lines. And the way that comes back in the final line, they get to be dismantled elms, something that Bishop knows that the painter didn't know. Anyway, it reminded me a little bit of At the Fish Houses.
The Fish Houses,
yes.
Yeah.
It is like what we imagine knowledge to be, yeah.
I agree with you. I agree with you.
It's beautiful.
And any other comments, Marita? I know we're running out of time, and you've been so generous with. I think you are not in the library today.
No, I am definitely at home today.
I see from what's on the wall behind you.
Right, different from the bookshelves. I'm just going through the comments, and I just wanted to. There were a lot of people saying how much this poem really touched them, and I just wanted to share that.
Oh, thank you. Great. That I haven't really been looking at the comments. Thank you for making the comments, and really thank you for joining the discussion today. It's a wonderful poem that's not, I think it's not one of Bishop's most celebrated poems, and I think it's one of her very best poems, and I love it, and I'm so glad to hear your thoughtful comments about it. I always learn something. I always learn something from those of you I know who are participants. And thank you all for joining the conversation. We'll have another one in around a month, and I have no idea what the poem is going to be yet. But look forward to it, and thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lloyd.
Lloyd.
Wonderful. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Marita, for letting this happen.
My pleasure. It's great to be a part of it. Take care, everyone. See you next month.